Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. In this presentation, I'll talk about TypeProf for IDE, which brings the modern development experience to Ruby. Before the main topic, let me introduce myself first. My name is Yusuke Endoh. My Twitter handle is Mameta. I am a Ruby committer working at CookPad. Our company, CookPad, has employed two Ruby core committers, Koichi Sasada, who is an author of the current Ruby's VM, and me. My main contribution for Ruby is the design and implementation of keyword arguments. I first implemented keyword arguments for Ruby 2.0, and I was involved in the redesign for Ruby 3. I also implemented coverage.so, which is Ruby's test coverage feature. You may have used SimpleCov, which uses coverage.so as a backend. And my recent contribution is the implementation of TypeProf. This is today's topic. Before the main topic, I'd like to show you my recent small improvement for Ruby called error highlight. See this code. It attempts to extract a value from JSON data. However, it has type. Bar is spelled as B-A-R-R. By running this code, no method error is raised. Unfortunately, this error message is somewhat unhelpful. In this line, there are two possibilities that raise the exception. One is that reading who returns new. The other is that reading bar returns new. We could not distinguish these possibilities only by the error message. We had to add debug printing and rerun the program. Since Ruby 3.1, the error message will show more detailed explanation. It says that the no method error was raised when reading buzz, so we can understand that reading bar returned nil without rerun. And this feature was originally created by Ruby committer Yuichiro Kaneko, and I completed the implementation. This is already included in the development branch of Ruby and will be released as a part of Ruby 3.1 this December. This is the agenda of this talk. First, I'll introduce TypeProf and some tools related to types for Ruby 3. And then I will talk about its integration with IDE, integrated development environments such as VS Code. Then I will briefly explain how to use TypeProf for IDE and will conclude this talk. So first is TypeProf. This is a static type analyzer for Ruby. The basic feature of TypeProf is the type inference of Ruby code. For example, consider this Ruby code. It defines user class which has initialize method and creates its instance. This code is very plain. It has no type annotation, just as you usually write. When you feed this code to TypeProf, it guesses method signatures and outputs them in RBS format. In this case, the generated signature says that there is a class definition called user, and it has a method called initialize, which accepts a string instance as an argument. Today, I do not explain how TypeProf analyzes Ruby code. If you are interested in it, please see my previous talk at RubyConf 2019. If you have heard about type system for Ruby 3 before, you may be confused because there are many names: TypeProf, RBS, Step, Sorbet, blah blah. I'd like to explain each of them in one phrase. RBS is Ruby's official type definition language. TypeProf is a static type analyzer for Ruby. Step is a static type analyzer for Ruby. Sorbet is also a static type analyzer for Ruby. So please remember, RBS is the name of a dedicated mini language to describe class and method signatures for Ruby code. And others are names of static type analyzers. Next, you may wonder why there are so many type analyzers for Ruby. This is because they have different philosophies. This is a comparison table between the three tools. The goal of TypeProf is to analyze Ruby code with no modification to the language. In other words, we don't want to require users to write so many type annotations in Ruby code. For the sake, we put a lot of effort into type inference. The other hand, Steep and Sorbet requires users to write type annotations as a comment or in a dedicated DSL language. They report almost nothing about existing Ruby code that has no type annotations. I think this is a bit cumbersome. However, if you write type annotation to your code, their error reporting is very accurate. Also, their approach is fast. Especially, Sorbet is really fast because the analyzer is written in C++. This is arguably a good thing for users. On the other hand, our approach is very slow and leads to false positives and false negatives. This is a drawback for TypeProf compared to Steep and Sorbet, I admit. In a case where TypeProf produces longest or where its analysis is painfully slow, you can write RBS manually to guide or accelerate TypeProf. Anyway, I think this is a trade-off. TypeProf and Steep are based on RBS language. They accept the same RBS files. Actually, they are using the same definition for the Ruby core features such as array and string. On the other hand, Sorbet uses their own language. Steep and Sorbet have IDE integration. TypeProf did not have this feature for a long time, but this year I focused on the development effort of this feature, and it's finally working. I have already showed you an example of RBS earlier. There are many rich features to express Ruby's code in type level, but I'd like to omit the details in this presentation. The most notable characteristics of RBS is that it is a separate file from Ruby code. The design was chosen because Matt, the designer of Ruby, wanted to avoid embedding any kind of type annotations into the language itself. Some people hate this design. They say header files suck. However, the problem may be partially solved by TypeProf for IDE, as I will show later. So next, I'd like to introduce TypeProf for IDE. TypeProf for IDE is a VS Code extension for Ruby. It uses TypeProf as a backend. So assume that you are editing Ruby code in VS Code. TypeProf for IDE monitors VS Code and notifies all code changes to TypeProf in real time. In this example, TypeProf notices that one plus string will raise an exception when executed. It reports the possible type error to VS Code, and VS Code shows it to users by drawing a red underline. Also, TypeProf for IDE also supports completion in a similar way. Okay, I'd like to demonstrate TypeProf for IDE. This is very plain Ruby code. It defines user class features, attribute and name, initialize method, and say hello method. It also has a simple test. Let's turn on TypeProf. Okay, some gray lines are added. As you see, these lines represent the signatures of each method. For example, the signature of the initialize method says that it accepts a string and returns a void. And the sayHello method accepts a string and returns a string. Okay. Let's try to call user new constructor with a long number of arguments. Let underline appears. By hovering the mouse cursor over it, you will see a familiar error message. Long number of arguments given 2 except it 1. Next is goTo definition. By right-clicking a method name and selecting goTo definition, you can jump to the definition line. Alternatively, you can click the method name with Control key hold. Okay, next is a demonstration of completion. This variable John is a user. So if I type say hello is completed. The method say hello returns a string, so this variable message has a string here. If you attempt to call any method on it, it shows the candidate of grab, hash, scan, blah blah. So we can confirm TypeProf correctly infers the type. The last demonstration is a hint for method arguments. If you write open parenthesis after the method name, it shows a pop-up. This is a bit interesting because it accepts only one argument. For demonstration, I extend the argument with an optional argument to the dummy. Then the hint shows 2 arguments. The second one has a question mark. This means that this argument is optional in our base. By the way, the first one is emphasized because now the cursor is placed at the first argument. If we write something and comma, the second argument dummy is emphasized. If we move the cursor, the emphasis responds to it. Okay, great. What I want to say in this demonstration is that the modern development experience is feasible even with the type annotations. Also, TypeProf displays RBS description by interspersing them to a Ruby file. I believe that this is one answer to header file sucks issue. Then I'd like to explain how to configure TypeProf ID to your codebase. This slide shows how to configure TypeProf ID. First, you need to use the development version of Ruby because it depends on Ruby's internal API. Second, you need to add TypeProf to gem file as usual. Third, you must configure RBS collection to allow TypeProf to read RBS files of gems that your code is using. Then search VS Code extension by TypeProf and install it. Finally, open your folder with VS Code. I think it should work if you are lucky. TypeProf ID is very preliminary, so I think there are many cases where it doesn't work well. Please give it a try with a warm heart. To be honest, I have never tried Rails code yet. I'd appreciate it if you could try plain old and small Ruby code first. Unfortunately, TypeProf ID may not work well even if you configure it correctly. There are 2 tricks to use TypeProf ID. One is to write a simple test in each file. The other is to write RBS. I will explain them with demonstration. The example I demonstrated contains a test at the last. This test is guarded by if statement with condition $0 = file. This is a trick to execute the code block only when this file is passed to Ruby interpreter directly. TypeProf uses this code to guess the method signatures. Let's delete this test. TypeProf no longer guesses a method signature correctly. This is due to the analysis approach of TypeProf. TypeProf infers method signatures by searching method calls and inferring what types are passed. If TypeProf cannot find any method calls, it assumes all methods accept untyped arguments. This analysis approach brings somewhat interesting behavior. For example, consider you pass a long type to a method. In this case, say how method is supposed to accept a string, but wrongly you pass an integer. However, the method call is not warned. Instead, the method signature is changed to accept not only string but also an integer. I like this behavior because, in my opinion, it is fitted to Ruby, which is very tolerant for types. However, this behavior is not useful in some cases. To make TypeProf warn the call site instead of changing the method signature, you need to write RBS to tell TypeProf a supposed method signature. You can write RBS directly, of course, but TypeProf provides us support. Just click the guest RBS. Then RBS prototype is created by TypeProf for IDE. You tweak this definition if needed and save it. Then return to original code. Now the RBS say hello method is shown with a hash mark. This mark means that the RBS is manually specialized, not guessed. Again, let's pass a long type to say hello method. Now the call is warned instead of changing the method signature. So you can write RBS to fix the method signature. Okay, so I summarize the Protips. Currently, TypeProf requires a plain old style test in each file to guess method signatures. I admit this design is very arguable because many Ruby users are familiar with a rich test framework such as RSpec. It might be theoretically possible to make TypeProf load RSpec style tests, but maybe it requires much more work. And you need to write RBS if you want to fix method signatures. Otherwise, a long method call changes method signatures. Also, if there's a handwritten RBS description, TypeProf uses it instead of guessing from code, which makes TypeProf analysis faster. Note that TypeProf is very slow, unfortunately. Currently, TypeProf for IDE stops TypeProf analysis within 1 second. If your code is big, complex, TypeProf cannot analyze it within 1 second, and no guesses will be displayed. In such case, it is practically mandatory to write RBS to allow TypeProf to analyze your code. Okay, I'd like to conclude my talk. As you may know, TypeProf is bundled with Ruby itself. I'd like to bundle with Ruby 3.1 TypeProf version that supports IDE features. I'd appreciate it if you could play with it and give me any feedback. You may wonder if it is ready for production. To be honest, TypeProf is still very preliminary, but I hope it should work with plain old and small programs. If your code base is large, maybe you first need to write RBS for gems that your code is using. This is a repository to place RBS files for some famous gems. In short, in other words, this repository is RBS version of definitely typed for TypeScript. But anyway, currently it only contains a very limited set of gems. So please consider contribute to enrich this repository. And this will help not only TypeProf but also Steep. Acknowledgement. I'd like to thank these people for fruitful discussion to help me implement and enhance TypeProf. Especially, Yuta Saito was involved in the project to implement TypeProf for IDE as an intern student of our company, QuickPad. He created go-to definition features and performance improvement of completion and packaging VS Code extension in 10 days. Only 10 days is great. Without his cooperation, TypeProf for IDE would not have been possible. Okay, conclusion. TypeProf for IDE aims to make Ruby's development experience better without full type annotation. TypeProf is still growing, so stay tuned. That's all. Thank you.